In the early 1980s, the Rivers Farm had 8 employees and grew row crops on 1,500 acres in North Sumter County, South Carolina. J.T. Rivers Jr. started the farm in 1955, and his son Buddy joined him in 1979 after he'd married and finished college. Buddy's father remembered the 50s and 60s being extremely wet, so he'd used very little irrigation. But then they got hit with a massive drought.
Well, corn likes water, and that's a crop that has to have it's got a 2-week window. It's have to have rain, or else you don't make a corn crop. Because we have such sandy soils in South Carolina. As you know, our soils just don't hold water. We're never more than 10 days away from a drought in South Carolina, no matter what happens.
So the Rivers Farm started putting in irrigation and center pivots, which helped stabilize their yields. But they still needed rain, and in 1989 they finally got it.
We got plenty of rain and everything looked really good. We had already harvested the corn. We finished it up in August. It was a really good crop. We had a great peanut crop, and we had a solid 2-bale cotton crop out there and a really good bean crop coming.
And even more rain was coming, but in the form of a hurricane.
Well, we knew the storm was coming, so we secured everything we could. Any objects that would fly, we had battened down. We took all the machinery and put it up under the shed.
Hurricane Hugo made landfall in South Carolina as a Category 4 storm. Wind gusts topped 115 miles per hour in some places, knocking down trees and power lines. And rainfall was 4 to 5 inches.
I got home about dark, and my wife and I were sitting in the kitchen. And I remember before the power went out, the TV said that Hugo, the storm, was still off the coast of South Carolina. And I looked out the window and the screens were flapping in the wind. If it was still 50 miles off the coast, that was 150 miles from the house, and it was already hurricane winds, we were in trouble. My son was 5 years old at the time, and we pulled a mattress in the hall, which we figured was the safest place. And we put him to sleep on that, but we didn't sleep. Throughout the night, it sounded like people were up in the attic with hammers just beating on the attic. It was a right interesting night. You hear limbs crack and fly by the windows, and the northeast corner of the eye came right over this farm. The eye is very calm. And you look outside, you see the stars. And I said, well, whew, this thing's over, but then it gets rough again.
They listened to the roof cracking and swaying above them in the dark, and monitored a large pine tree through the back window.
During the storm, we had flashlights, and we'd look out the window, and it would be leaning very much towards one way, and we'd all run over to the other side of the house. And the wind would change, it was leaning the other way, and we'd all run back to the other side. And it finally came down through the kitchen, and I was very happy that it did, because we knew where it was then. Because there was no power, there was no way to see anything, no way to tell anything until morning. First memory I had of opening the door that morning was it smelled like pine trees. It was pine scent everywhere, and that's because all the pine trees were split, broken, and cracked and torn up. You had to look twice and just think about what it looked like the night before.
Buddy and his father surveyed the damage to their farm.
I looked over at the grain bins, and our dryer was turned upside down. All our augers were turned upside down.
And the machinery they had been so careful to protect?
The sheds fell on the machinery and tore it all up, so that was a terrible mistake we made, and I learned from that.
Despite the damage to their equipment, they still had crops to farm and no way to get fuel.
We had to walk everywhere we went because you couldn't get the cars out of the yard. It was just a mess. We had to scramble around for about a week and try to save what we had harvested.
Some farmers reported losing up to 75% of their corn crop and 50% of their soybeans.
We had to pick cotton and peanuts and soybeans that year around roofs of houses that were in our field. And we had just started picking cotton and picked probably 20 acres of 75 that we had defoliated, and the cotton was gone. It looked like it had all been picked.
Buddy lost half his cotton crop. And his corn?
The bins were full of corn, and the storm had popped the tops off of it, and it had gotten wet. We didn't have any power to run the fans to dry that. The peanut buying point didn't have any power to dry it. No electricity for water. Everything was at a standstill without electricity.
Luckily, they were able to dry and preserve their corn with a 35 kilowatt diesel generator that they had purchased to run their first irrigation systems.
It was right out a month before we got power.
In fact, the power grid would have to be completely rebuilt. Buddy Rivers estimates the farm lost over $1 million in revenue that year from Hugo. And, like many other farmers, they had no insurance to help in recovery.
There was no winners and losers in this thing. It took years to recover.
Today, the Rivers farm only has 4 employees, but has grown to 2,500 acres, investing largely in the same crops, but using much more irrigation. Buddy's father has since passed away, and his son has joined him in the business, carrying on the family tradition. And together they're working as hard as ever.